Hudson Williams, one of the breakout stars of the hit show Heated Rivalry, was recently involved in a scandal involving his Letterboxd account. The account, which he'd been using for a while, included some reviews which people deemed to be overly harsh. Thus, the sheer backlash propelled him into deleting said account on the platform. Williams is not the first celebrity to fall victim to the leaking of a Letterboxd account, and I doubt he will be the last. Recently, a very similar thing happened to Ayaweda Biri, and upon the leaking of her Letterboxd account, it's kind of turned into a bit of a bit. However, what really sealed the deal that I needed to talk about this was an article that I saw reporting on the scandal. Its title read, "Letterboxd claims its first celebrity victim of the year, Hudson Williams." What I personally found interesting, however, was its subtitle, which read, "I'm sure Hudson wasn't expecting all this to unfold, but may future generations learn from his mistakes." This warning, this idea that Williams had made a mistake to begin with, raised alarm bells in my brain about how our current culture treats personal opinion. It brought to mind a quote from Tina Fey, who was on the Las Culturistas podcast, which oddly enough this article also referenced. When speaking to Bowen Yang about his pop culture podcast, where he and his co-host Matt Rogers would frequently express their unfiltered opinions about pop culture, she said, "I regret to inform you, but you are too famous now, sir. That authenticity is dangerous and expensive," warning him that once he starts publicly critiquing filmmakers, he risks his chances at future work. This speaks to a larger issue that is trickling down to everybody. This microscopic lens that we're all under, this surveillance state that we've created for ourselves that isn't giving us room to grow and evolve and change. The internet has become a forever place, a place that is stuck in time and seemingly permanent. A single misstep could lead to real-world issues. So I want to explore why we are so quick to self-censor and what that means for the artistic mediums moving forward. The risk of monolithic opinions in our collective society and the death of traditional criticism in a world that seems to be more opinionated than ever. Film criticism is as old as the medium itself. However, surprisingly, the art of criticism itself is relatively new. The idea of modern art criticism didn't begin until the Enlightenment of the 18th century. The reason is this period in time marked a rise in free speech, in the right to an opinion, and the free circulation of ideas. It was a time period where people realized that the world was not governed by universals, but rather individuals with their own thoughts and ideas. Denis Diderot, the French philosopher, art critic, and writer, who was a prominent figure during the Age of Enlightenment, reported on the salons from 1759 to 1771, and 1775 to 1781, and these pieces of writing mark the beginning of modern art criticism. The salons themselves began in 1667 and were the official art exhibition of the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Between 1748 and 1890, it was arguably the greatest annual or biannual event in the Western world. His pieces were detailed reports that were meant to be sold as critical guides to the most popular annual art event in Paris. What's fascinating about these pieces, though, is that he made no effort to review or discuss the art through an objective lens. This is an idea that didn't creep up into criticism until the late 19th century. Instead, his critical response was very much his own voice, letting personal opinion bleed into his musings on the pieces. Thus, as cinema emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was already poised to have criticism birthed alongside this new medium. Early critics were primarily focused on the technical aspects of filmmaking. After all, film was an entirely new medium. General audiences were captured by the magic of the movies, and it spawned individuals who wanted to understand and critique what they were seeing. During this era of filmmaking, which was the silent era, one of the most renowned critics was Gilbert Seldes, who wrote for the prestigious publication The Dial. It was Seldes who introduced the concept of criticism as an art form. His reviews laid the foundation for the future of film criticism. Seldes's belief, which underpinned most of his career, was the democratization of culture. It's hard to frame our minds around this period of time, but with all of these new art forms emerging, film being one of them, jazz being another, comics being another, the conventional understandings of these art forms were at the time immoral, aesthetically questionable. They were not held in as high regard as the more storied historical European art forms. In a way, this is what made Seldes so revolutionary. He didn't limit his consumption of art to those deemed high culture like opera, ballet and classical music. He rejected the idea that culture was inherently ordered or demanded rigorous training to create or understand. He was far more interested in his ability to discern between well-executed art in any form and art which was not. He proclaimed that excellence could be found at any level, just as much as mediocrity could. He insisted that the distinction between high and lowbrow forms of art stemmed from class assumptions rather than the judgment of the art itself. He said, "The lively arts are created and admired chiefly by the class known as lowbrows, are patronised and, to an extent, enjoyed by the highbrows, and are treated as impostors and as contemptible vulgarism by the middle class, those who invariably are ill at ease in the presence of great art until it has been approved by authority." I mean, he was kind of revolutionary at his time. The contemporaries around him were not evaluating popular culture as legitimate forms of art like he was. Unlike critics like H.L. Mencken and George Jean Nathan, who protested the films were vulgar, Seldes believed that film could be used as a tool for American historical education. He describes film's essential feature as movement, and that happens to be one of the dominant characteristics of all American history. He found film to be tied to America's cultural identity. He was not only a figurehead for film, but also was an advocate for the democratization of cultural criticism. He advocated that critical opinion should support films that reached mass audiences, and was a big advocate for the rise of film criticism in the 1920s. However, he did predict that this rise in film would lead to a decline in literary culture in the 1930s. This is by no means an extensive look into Seldes. He is an absolutely fascinating figure and part of the reason that we have criticism of popular culture. His reviews laid the path for film criticism. From here, we enter the golden age of Hollywood. The invention of synchronized sound in the late 1920s led to this golden age, and just as the films continued to evolve and grow, so did the critics. Films themselves became more sophisticated and complex, telling deeper and more personal stories, and critics evolved alongside them, no longer simply looking at the technical aspects of a film, but looking at how that film exists in the wider context of the world. Looking into the cultural, social, and political implication of films, suddenly the reviews were no longer simple assessments of the technical craftsmanship on display, but rather discussions around that film's place in the broader context of film history and the events going on outside of the film. These reviews both engaged readers to think more critically about the media that they were consuming, but also challenged filmmakers on their decisions in the hopes that these filmmakers would get better at their work. There are tons of notable film critics who emerged at this time, not limited to Pauline Kael, Roger Ebert, and Bosley Crowther, who all gained international acclaim for their insights into film. Around the same sort of time that these film critics were gaining attention and traction, it also marked a shift in film criticism. In the 1950s and 1960s, the rise of the French New Wave and critics like Francois Truffaut and André Bazin introduced the idea of auteur theory, the idea that directors are the true authors of their films, that the films are a result of their singular vision. The introduction of this idea brought a whole slew of discourse. Some critics began to focus on directors' individual styles at this point, claiming that the films on offer were a result of their ideas and shaping the way audience perceived some films. Film criticism was challenged yet again with the invention of the modern blockbuster in the 1970s. Suddenly critics were being pulled between discussing the technical craftsmanship of a film, the cultural, social, and political impact of the film, and also the cultural impact that the movies were having on popular culture. This was further exacerbated in the digital age, bringing about mass cultural events and films that did incredibly well at the box office. Suddenly the cultural significance and also the entertainment that a film was providing had to be taken into account. What I find fascinating, particularly about the modern age of film criticism, especially in the early 21st century, is that often in pieces written about film criticism at the time, critics were really having to contend with the idea that films might be popular culture, and this was going to be a detriment to the idea of film criticism. And weirdly, if you look back at Seldes, he kind of championed the idea that films should be democratized, and that there was just as much value in popular culture as there was in these more older, more traditional art forms. Now that film has evolved itself and can be broken up into more highbrow and lowbrow pieces of film, I find it utterly fascinating that kind of the advent of film criticism was to bridge this idea of them being separated forms of culture and to judge each film on its own merits. As he said, he was far more interested in the ability to discern between well-executed art in any form and art which was not. Perhaps he would be a fan of how film criticism has evolved very recently with the introduction of the internet. It has democratized opinions with the invention of sites like Letterboxd. Anybody is able to be a film critic. Anybody is able to share their opinions and thoughts on a film with everybody. Traditionally, throughout the history of film, there has been a feedback loop between critics and filmmakers. It was a symbiotic system that fed into each other. Critics were there to make the art better, and the art was better as a result of the critics. But if everybody is a critic, where does that lead us? The role of a film critic throughout the 20th century was rarely a democratized role and very much operated in a hierarchy. To make a very broad and sweeping statement, we simply do not have critics in the same way that we did back then. Critics who were lauded as much as the filmmakers themselves. People whose job it was to guide an audience on what to see and what they said could have a profound impact on the success of a film. Now, yes, it is still true that critics are hired for the sole purpose of being a film critic for a publication, but the role of this individual is far less clear, and moreover, the role is rarely a contracted staff position now. More and more critics are becoming freelance and writing for a variety of publications. Couple that with the fact that a lot of major publications are actually laying off their staff writers, and I truly mean major publications. Only a few months ago, Vanity Fair's film critic Richard Lawson, as well as several other journalists, were laid off. Criticism of the arts had forever been a very difficult industry to break into, but publications have made it virtually impossible for a budding critic to get any sort of start in the industry. If longtime veterans are having their jobs erased, where does that leave film criticism? Well, it's a double-edged sword. These positions are disappearing and being cut because the need for a stamp of approval, of validation from major publications, has become obsolete with the invention of the internet, a place where every opinion bears the same weight. Well, not quite, but we'll get back to that. In the bygone era of staffed film critics, it's very easy to look back on this time with rose-colored glasses, that everybody who made it, who was hired, was clearly done so due to the merits that they held in regards to criticism. And that wasn't always the case. Like everything, it was all about who you knew, as well as being talented. The best example of this is the Cahiers du Cinéma group. This included many famous critics, some turned filmmakers like Francois Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard. In the 50s in Paris, this group was hired to write for the Cahiers du Cinéma, largely through their connections to the editor of the magazine, André Bazin. This isn't surprising. This happens and has happened in every industry. It is far more important who you know than what you do or how well you do it. This meant, though, that there was a clear hierarchy of film critics. Those who were well connected and had acclaim reaped in the rewards of such status. Meanwhile, those who didn't simply aspired to hold that level of recognition. So, surely with the invention of the internet, this place where everybody could have a voice, this would finally democratize film criticism and allow for new and diverse voices to be heard. In this new digital age, we really are moving away completely from traditional criticism. However, the thirst for criticism is not disappearing. Some would argue it's more valued than ever, what with the sheer output of some studios now. Critics are used to guide audiences on what is worth their time. Yet the staffed writers are slowly disappearing. Written articles and deep dives into film are few and far between, and are being replaced by reactionary content and aggregate reviews. This is simply the landscape of the internet. The age of influence is here. It's something I will only dip my toe into slightly, as this would take us on a whole other rabbit hole, but the birth of quick reactionary content is a symptom of the larger plague on humanity: social media. Everything has to be distilled into as short a video as possible. Everything has to have a hook. Everything is made to maximize retention time and to serve the algorithm. Say what you want about the criticism of old, but the art form itself, the idea of critics being there to serve the filmmaker and the audience, that idea of criticism is slowly going away. This isn't to slander every social media user. I'm very aware that I'm talking to you through social media. The irony is not lost on me. I also have plenty of incredible creators I follow who are this next evolution of critics, but it's also a numbers game. There's a hierarchy here, just like there was in the golden age of film criticism. The difference here is that the hierarchy is not about the position that you hold, but the followers that you have. This silly little number dictates a lot. It dictates whether or not people are able to make a living off of criticism. There's no security like there would be in a staffed position. It also creates this harsh feedback loop of letting what an algorithm deems good influence more of what a critic should make in order to substantially boost their numbers, oftentimes these videos being reactionary and less well informed. In a New York Times piece published a little while back with the heading, "They review movies on TikTok but don't call them critics," it said that they think that movie talk is that successful because people turn away from film critics as they are not trustworthy anymore and they're outdated. At least those TikTokers think they are. It's so fascinating to me because I think this actually misunderstands what criticism is and has always been. There has and will always be a level of skepticism when it comes to larger critics. The landscape actually hasn't changed all that much. Perhaps the modes in which people actually achieve their jobs. Staff writers, much like film creators with large followings, are invited to large events, press screeners, red carpets, and the like. The mistrust that comes with these opportunities is still present. The difference being that there's a level of parasocial relationship associated with a film critic on social media that was abstracted from traditional critics. It's this feeling of a relationship, that feeling that you know somebody, that increases your trust. I do also think, though, that social media has democratized criticism in a way that traditional media was unable to do. It only takes an algorithm for you to stumble upon somebody who you really align with and thereby creating a level of trust. It's the medium which has changed, not the idea of critics. Sure, you get people who aren't interested in criticism for whatever reason that may be. The flashy events, the brand deals are what they want to achieve. They want to maintain relationship with studios, so will happily recommend something they didn't like. But this also occurred in traditional media. It's true that studios aren't allowed to bribe or pay for reviews, but they are able to use their power in other ways to garner a better take, and really it comes down to the individual. This is perhaps why there is more trust in social media. It's on that person who stumbles across a critic to make up their mind on whether or not they're being real. It also just allows more room for diversity. Social media has created this participatory culture whereby it increases the diversity in what is spoken about. There's an interview with a senior film critic about the New York Times article that I think sums up pretty well the state of criticism. They said, "But also, I feel that if movie talkers say this is kind of different because they have their audience, and the audience is determined by the medium. So 60-year-old people don't go to see TikTok reviews. They speak directly to their audience, and their audience loves them. So there's this emotional connection. So yeah, maybe what I'm writing is irrelevant for your audience, but that doesn't mean what I'm doing is irrelevant in general. So if your audience are people who watch Hollywood movies and Netflix, they're not going to care about my review of a 150-minute Hungarian film anyway. So in this sense, it is irrelevant for them. But I think it would be great if there is someone who has a relatively significant following on TikTok, who's promoting some unknown films, and I don't mean underrated films from 2 years ago. I really mean like art films and so on. Right now, there's a space for all types of criticism because the mediums have viewers. That may stop at some point. And I view this critic's words as a warning of sorts, that it is the responsibility of people with significant followings to champion smaller films. What I'm finding is there really is very little difference between the people who called themselves critics in traditional media and in social media. It was also on the larger traditional critics to champion smaller movies, even if their reviews would get less clicks. The difference here is that the landscape is murkier. Who calls themselves a critic? If somebody is invited to a red carpet event to get videos and post said videos saying it's incredible, does that make them a critic? Does the person who sits and writes reviews for social media get called an influencer? Where do the lines start? Or do they even exist? Film content on social media is so easily mistaken for film promotion. Of course, these types of videos have their place and are incredibly valuable to the landscape of film, but not in the way that a traditional review would have been. Interestingly as well, the idea of traditional critics being gatekeepers has been debated, and the rise of social media and participatory culture seems to be helping get rid of this. It's interesting to keep referring to critics as a collective because at the end of the day, in both traditional media and this new digital age, it's so individualistic. Whether or not somebody's word should be weighed differently is dependent on so many things. Were they influenced by how they saw a film? Do they feel the need to promote a film? Have they seen many films? And how does this inform their opinion on other films? Who are they? So many things. This idea also isn't new, that criticism is formed by personal opinion. Before art criticism was widely considered to have been started in the sense of how we know it now, it is generally agreed that the origins of the writing of art are in Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors and Architects, which first appeared in 1550, then enlarged in 1568. Vasari was an accomplished painter and architect. He came from a distinguished artistic family and was a friend of Michelangelo, the artist he came to champion above all others. Written before there was any distinction at all between forms of art writing, let alone art criticism and art history, Vasari's lives are a trove of anecdote and opinion, his likes and dislikes, and as a result, many of his portraits of the artists of his time and before are quite distorted. So it's really not a new idea to have criticism be a result of individual and personal opinions. This is kind of an undeniable fact of criticism. It is very difficult to achieve an objective opinion on an individual basis. Perhaps then this is why we have so much reverence for aggregates now. As the internet has evolved, information has had to be packaged in the quickest way possible to convey the meaning to the reader. Long gone are the days where people are seeking out lengthy written reviews to make a judgment on whether or not they're going to see a movie. Instead, this has been replaced with websites which promote aggregate scores to tell a reader in an instant whether or not a piece of art on offer is worthy of their time. There are many sites that do this, like IMDb and Letterboxd. However, they operate on a more conventional basis, whereby the aggregate scores are collated from the average scores given to the films by their users. Conversely, Rotten Tomatoes, perhaps the biggest of the aggregate websites, does not operate this way. It's well known and well documented the operating procedure of Rotten Tomatoes. If you're unaware, Rotten Tomatoes works based on an aggregate system that deems every review either positive or negative, with a positive review being a 6 or 10 or higher and a negative review being lower than that. When this comes to aggregating the score for critics and audiences, they collate up the number of positive and negative reviews, and the percentage shown is a reflection of that. This means that a film that is widely regarded as fine, very middle of the road, and achieves a bulk of reviews that are 6 out of 10, could, and often does, have a higher score than films which are divisive and produce a varying range of opinions. All of this data though, all of this detail is lost when this is aggregated into a percentage. And what is hilarious is actually it isn't even that much detail. Showing the range of reviews, something like a graph on Letterboxd, is a step more detailed than this, but in the grand scheme of things, it's still not that detailed. Within film circles, Rotten Tomatoes is largely criticized for its system and the way it showcases the value of a film. However, this has not stopped it from being one of the biggest ways that viewers choose to decide what to watch or to affirm their opinions. You only need to look at their social media accounts to understand the power and influence that sites like this have. When a new film drops, there's a tomato meter reveal whereby the percentage is presented to an audience on how good a film is. When you search for a film on Google, it is one of the stats that pops up on the search page. Streaming services have integrated Rotten Tomatoes into their platforms so viewers can see in an instant whether or not that film is worthy of watching. Is this the fault of the platform, or is it the fault of how we as a larger society engage with that platform? That could be debated. What's kind of undeniable though is the impact that this has had on the industry and the symbiotic system that this creates with studios. In the golden era of movie critics, there was a system in place where the critics would feed back into the art in the hopes of making it better. With the landscape as it is and these aggregate platforms becoming more valued than the opinion of a critic, it's no wonder that these platforms are influencing the way that films are being made. A few years back, there was a New York Times article which expressed the fears of studios on the influence of Rotten Tomatoes. Given that our world has only become more online since, it is a fair assessment to assume that the site still holds a lot of power. Now, this is a site that favors movies to be the most broadly appealing, because if you start to introduce divisiveness, you risk getting a lower percentage. Making movies that are the most palatable to a general audience is not an inherently new idea. The idea of a 4-quadrant movie has been around for some time. A 4-quadrant movie is a movie that appeals to the 4 demographic quadrants of the movie-going audience, both male and female, and both over and under the age of 25. The term started being used by Hollywood trade newspapers in the late 1990s, but while the term gained traction in the late 90s, the practice of creating films with as wide appeal as possible was not a new concept, and can be attributed to the golden age of Hollywood in the late 70s and early 80s, with filmmakers like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas spearheading the 4-quadrant movie. At the time, these would just be deemed blockbusters. It was these movies that ushered in the idea of creating something that has mass appeal to it. Now, this isn't to say that films with mass appeal are devoid of artistic value or are somehow worse than divisive films. It just is interesting when viewed through the lens of studios wanting to achieve palatability in favor of artistic vision, because palatability means better numbers, which means more money. The stats for Americans going to the cinema each year are kind of nuts. On average, an American will go 3 times a year. If the average American is using Rotten Tomatoes as a platform to dictate what they should see, and when they go onto a movie page, they see that it's rotten, that might have a bearing on whether or not they go see the movie. As much as people would like to say that these sites don't have a bearing on what Hollywood makes or what gets marketed or gets into more screens, it very much has that effect. The studios didn't invent Rotten Tomatoes, and most of them don't like it, says the filmmaker Paul Schrader. But the system is broken. Audiences are dumber. Normal people don't go through reviews like they used to. Rotten Tomatoes is something the studios can game, so they do. There's this whole other side to the platform as well, whereby the studios manipulate the people that give reviews, the people that are invited to screeners and such, to just ensure that they're giving the film a positive rating, and thus giving them a better percentage. It's this kind of horrible feedback loop. The sad thing is, it's far easier to gamify and influence a score than it is a full written review by a film critic. Divisive media is good and healthy. It has a place in our society. There's a heap of examples of movies that were critically panned or misunderstood or divisive at the time that are now lauded and adored by people, like Jennifer's Body, Blade Runner, and Eyes Wide Shut. The thing is, with the state of Hollywood as it is, a film that presents a risk, and more so a financial risk, will be favoured less than a film that is palatable and appealing to the masses. In the aim to make things more palatable, the divisive films, and not only divisive, but anything that is not deemed super normal, have become subject to criticism that exists outside of film. There's plenty of films out there that depict a subject matter, event, or type of person that isn't a pleasant experience. But just because a film shows something doesn't mean it's an endorsement of that said thing, and this has become a very prevalent issue within criticism. This idea that depiction is not endorsement was popularized by Catherine Bigelow in a piece she wrote for the New York Times in regards to criticism of her film Zero Dark 30. She said, "Those of us who work in the arts know that depiction is not endorsement. If it were, no artist would be able to paint inhumane practices. No author could write about them, and no filmmaker could delve into the thorny subjects of our time. This is an important principle to stand up for, and it bears repeating." It's also not without weight. Sometimes films do go about depicting things in the wrong way, and it's a far more nuanced conversation in not necessarily what is depicted, but how it is depicted. However, in this reactionary environment of the internet, when reviews are aggregated, there are countless times where, because something is depicted on screen that somebody finds uncomfortable or unnecessary, it is branded as the film being bad. The film is judged based on its subject matter rather than the merits that make it a film. How are we to tell stories with thorny subject matters if immediately they're being reduced to unwatchable because of the content that they're dealing with? Without filmmakers trying to push the boundaries and tell divisive stories that might be met with a diverse range of opinions, we would be left with a landscape of film that would look very bleak. Some would argue that the major films that are currently released are an example of that bleak landscape. A lot of major films released now do face a lot of traditional criticism from the very few traditional critics remaining. However, major studios sometimes are not concerned at all about the presence of negative reviews because they have something more powerful on their side. Traditionally, in the golden age of critics, it was almost as if they acted like gatekeepers of media. Because of the limited number of jobs and the hierarchy that I've spoken about, there were very few people who were able to get into the spaces to see what the world of filmmaking had to offer. The advent of the internet had then democratized this, allowing anybody to express their opinion and anybody to break down the idea of media being gatekept from people. However, an interesting side effect of the internet giving access to everybody's opinions who has a keyboard is the extremism of some film criticism. if you could call it that. Some people take their loyalty to a filmmaker or talent, often being the actors involved in the project, to the extreme and give very little room for nuance in the discussion of film, as these voices are often the loudest. This idea of stan culture is incredibly prevalent in the music industry, but has made its way into film and TV as well. The people who are out there trying to remain critical and have balanced, nuanced opinions are finding it increasingly difficult to have a voice due to being shut down by stan culture. The idea that a person could point out any criticism of a movie, writer, actor, whoever it may be, then be met with hostility or accusations of hate is genuinely concerning. This is especially true on social media, where fandoms can quickly mobilize against mild critiques. This culture of pure loyalty to an artist, no matter what they do or what they make, raises alarm bells for the future of criticism. Are these people losing the ability to talk about media properly? Are we able to have meaningful discussions around whether a piece of film works without it being labeled disrespectful? There's an odd feedback loop here with aggregate systems and stan culture, where should a film or a person decide to take a risk and that is met with complete and utter praise every single time, does that hurt the artist involved in actually evolving their craft, which is what the art of criticism was formed based on? While it's true that everybody's opinion is subjective, that doesn't mean everybody's opinion is equal. The internet has a weird way of blurring whose voices should be taken with more importance. Does the person with complete and utter adoration over an actor and has massed a cult following because of it, does their voice matter more than the nuanced critic who sits and analyzes every piece of film on its own merit? In a weird way, and stay with me here, I think stan culture can be seen as a byproduct of auteur theory. I've said this many times, but I'm not a fan of auteur theory. I think it is absolutely the wrong way to be viewing art. However, there are some camps of academic thinking that do believe strongly in this theory. They believe that a director's style is able to persist through their entire body of work, that it transcends the idea of collaborative filmmaking. This idea that films are pieces of art solely falling on a singular person, especially in collaborative art forms, I just think it is a simplistic concept. However, many people do believe in it, and I do think it is a gateway to stan culture. The theory creates a sort of almost disregard for the other people who work on a film and places the sole results on the director. It's not too far of a leap to assume that some people in the 50s who were drawn to this theory and really believed in it had this blind loyalty to some filmmakers in the same way that stans of a certain actor or filmmaker do now. What's more is this idea of personal attachment fueling criticism has been around for ages. To go back to Vasari again, a large reason that his art criticism is not regarded as the start of art criticism is because when he was criticizing the art, he was concentrating on the artists themselves and less on the works of art they produce. In a weird way, I guess you could say that he was a stan for the people that he wrote about. It was more about how the personal fueled the art instead of just judging the art itself. This isn't to say that Vasari was unable to have a critical lens when it came to certain artists. Much like some people who are part of stan culture are still able to have nuanced criticism and discussions of the people that they stan. But on the whole, with the internet, the voices which dominate, the people who you hear, are these extreme loud opinions. If these are the dominant voices, the people who are leading the discourse and criticism around film, I think that's an issue. Criticism should be deep in opinions and knowledge about filmmaking and the way that films interact with our world. Just because you're a fan of a filmmaker, it doesn't mean that you should ignore issues. And it also doesn't mean that people should be seeking out reviews to affirm their opinion. Criticism should be challenging. We shouldn't shy away from the negatives. It's interesting because as a society, despite the internet being so toxic and aggressive at points, we do tend to shy away from negativity when it comes to criticism. There are a plethora of reasons why. I've spoken about some of them before, but the idea of people wanting to maintain good relationships with studios, wanting to preserve brand deals and that sort of stuff. An interesting thing that I noticed at the end of last year though was people making end of year lists for the best movies of the year, the best performances of the year, and some people were making the worst movies of the year. People who made these lists were getting backlash for making such lists, often hit with the criticism that you've never made a film in your life, you don't understand the effort and the work that's put into it. Why are you demeaning art like that? It is interesting because in a way, I understand. I didn't make one of these lists. Instead, I opted for my most disappointing movies of the year. because that puts the onus on me. But also, what is wrong with making a list like this? Criticism should be there to have this symbiotic relationship between the people who are critiquing the art and the people who are making it. If something was bad and is able to be expressed intellectually and involves a degree of criticism, then I think that's completely fair. However, this creeps into a territory where people are only allowed to express an opinion when it's deemed the collectively right opinion. If the opinion of a critic is expressing all of this valid criticism behind it, a lot of thought and effort has been put into the words that the critic wants to say, sometimes all of those words wash away and the opinion is met with backlash, and thus begins this horrible cycle of censoring reviews for fear of backlash. No real opinions are ever being spoken about, because if you did express a negativity or a criticism towards a filmmaker, you might be met with critical discourse, or you may be met with a stan who would immediately view the criticism as an attack on a person. The internet is so wide and vast that there are pockets of fandoms everywhere. There are people who like all sorts of different things. Differing opinions are allowed to exist, and not everything is an attack on a person. This idea of don't yuck somebody's yum, I think is very true. It's not the job of a critic to convince somebody who has a critical eye to understand why they might like something. They just might. So don't necessarily yuck somebody's yum, but scrutinize it, point out the flaws, rip it to shreds, and at the end of the day, if somebody still eats it and says it's good, you kind of just have to believe them. I believe with the vast amount of media out right now, the job of the critic has kind of changed to be more of a curator in the world. Negative reviews help people understand why they might not like things, and it lets people know that we don't need to like everything. Personally, if somebody hates or likes something where I feel the opposite, I get ecstatic to talk to them, to discuss that with them, to understand the other point of view. We don't need to come to the same conclusion, and we can still walk away with our own opinions. But that discourse is healthy, and I think we are losing that more and more. This speaks to the larger idea that we have forgotten how to have a conversation with each other. This is cropping up in politics time and time again. But I think equally, the internet has just become a place for discussion that is not allowed. Instead, people are just shouting into their own echo chambers. It's so dangerous to stay in your own lanes in any capacity: politics, films, music, history, whatever it may be. If you're not constantly expanding and trying to learn other points of view, that's really dangerous, and this isn't just happening in the world of criticism. This idea of anti-intellectualism, keeping people in their own lanes and making stuff that isn't really challenging, is cropping up time and time again in other places. I could do a whole other video about this, but have you ever seen press tours for a movie and just been absolutely bewildered why any of that is happening? Yes, let's see how well our cast know each other, or if the two leads are actually best friends. Why is this now treated as media journalism? Well, this again, I think, feeds right back into the idea of individual reviews for films not being weighted heavily as collective ideas. And the collective idea of stans is something so powerful, because they are the loudest voices on the internet. If you can create a viral moment, if you can make people fall in love with the lead of a movie, they're more likely to see it than they are if a seasoned staff writer gives it a glowing review. I think this quite nicely leads me back to Hudson Williams, the truly breakout star of Heated Rivalry. Somebody who would not be nearly as big if it weren't for the feverish stands around him, for the way that the press cycle for that show blew up. It's almost like a cyclical way that stands demanded more of these people, of the show, and thus more press was born in this like vicious cycle. And I find it so interesting that his letterbox was leaked, a place that he had written personal pieces, nuanced opinions, negative opinions about films, and all this surface level press, the interviews, the paparazzi photos, the skincare routines, that wasn't met with backlash. What was met with backlash was an attempt of an individual to provide intellectualism with something expressing their inner thoughts. It was enough for him to remove the account, and I think in the future, as the article said, maybe future generations will learn from his mistake. Maybe they will be glowingly positive about everything they see. Maybe everything will become an ad. Maybe everything will be positive for fear of repercussion, of securing the next job or getting a brand partnership. And at that point, where will we go for criticism? Well, I believe the critics will be there like they always have been. It just might be a little harder to find. If anything, just let this video serve as a reminder to seek out criticism. It will strengthen and deepen your relationship to art. Seek out people with differing opinions from you. Seek out voices that are not your own. Find critics who you do align with. I always find this to be really productive when you discover that you can differ on different things and how that might change or deepen your relationship to how you think about that movie. Know it's okay to have different opinions. That's what makes the world so colorful. It's fine to hate a movie everybody likes, and it's fine to love a critically panned movie. Just allow there to be room for this discussion, because it's through this discussion, this criticism, that we get better and continue to grow. Thank you so much for watching this video. This is my first video essay of the year, one in the bag. I honestly really loved writing this. I covered the Hudson Williams story on like my social media, and it kind of sent me spiraling a bit on my own thoughts around criticism, and this was a way just for me to, I guess, get feelings out, and I learned a lot in the process. I hope you learned a lot too. If you made it this far into the video, I'd love to know a film critic that you follow that you love. It could be in any capacity, traditional, social media, whatever. I would love to get more recommendations for film critics. If you like this video, give it a like and make sure to subscribe. Also make sure to follow me on Instagram and TikTok. That's where you will find my daily thoughts and musings about film and TV. And I will see you in the next video. Bye.